The Vietnam War was the prolonged struggle between nationalist forces attempting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government and the United States, with the aid of the South Vietnamese, attempting to prevent the spread of communism. Engaged in a war that many viewed as having no way to win, U.S. leaders lost the American public's support for the war. Since the end of the war, the Vietnam War has become a benchmark for what not to do in all future U.S. foreign conflicts. As the fighting between the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese continued, the U.S. continued to send additional advisors to South Vietnam. When the North Vietnamese fired directly upon two U.S. ships in international waters on August 2 and 4, 1964, known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution gave the President the authority to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson used that authority to order the first U.S. ground troops to Vietnam in March 1965. In 1954, after suffering a decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French decided to pull out of Vietnam. At the Geneva Conference of 1954, a number of nations met to determine how the French could peacefully withdraw. The agreement that came out of the conference, called the Geneva Accords, stipulated a ceasefire for the peaceful withdrawal of French forces and a temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, which split the country into Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam. In addition, a general democratic election was to be held in 1956 that would reunite the country under one government. The United States refused to agree to the election, fearing the Communists might win. With help from the United States, South Vietnam carried out the election only in South Vietnam rather than countrywide. After eliminating most of his rivals, Ngo Dinh Diem was elected. His leadership, however, proved so horrible that he was killed in 1963 during a coup supported by the United States. Since Diem had alienated many South Vietnamese during his tenure, Communist sympathizers in South Vietnam established the National Liberation Front, NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, in 1960 to use guerrilla warfare against the South Vietnamese. President Johnson's goal for U.S. involvement in Vietnam was not for the U.S. to win the war, but for U.S. troops to bolster South Vietnam's defenses until South Vietnam could take over. By entering the Vietnam War without a goal to win, Johnson set the stage for future public and troop disappointment when the U.S. found themselves in a stalemate with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. From 1965 to 1969, the U.S. was involved in a limited war in Vietnam. Although there were aerial bombings of the North, President Johnson wanted the fighting to be limited to South Vietnam. By limiting the fighting parameters, the U.S. forces would not conduct a serious ground assault into the north to attack the Communists directly. Nor would there be any strong effort to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Viet Cong supply path that ran through Laos and Cambodia. The Tet Offensive, the turning point of the Vietnam War. was a military campaign during the Vietnam War that was launched on January 30, 1968, by forces of the People's Army of Vietnam against the forces of the Republic of Vietnam, the United States, and their allies. The purpose of the offensive was to utilize the element of surprise and strike military and civilian command and control centers throughout South Vietnam, during a period when no attacks were supposed to take place. The initial attacks stunned the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies and took them by surprise. But most were quickly contained and beaten back, inflicting massive casualties on Communist forces.